Hello, everyone, and welcome to Uncivil Law, where we learn from the misfortunes of others. As always, I hope you'll enjoy this live content, and today will be the day that I earn your subscription. For today's stream, I'd like to talk a little bit about Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. He's someone I've been following for quite a long time, and he spoke yesterday at the Moody Theater at ACL Live in the great city of Austin, Texas. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about what I saw him speak about and a little bit about my general impressions of himself and his philosophy and why I like him so much. So I've been following Jordan Peterson for a fair amount of time. I had the privilege of seeing him 3 times in person when I lived in DC. I saw him twice in Washington, DC, and I saw him once in Baltimore at one of his 12 Rules for Life tours. And then I saw him for a 4th time last night. I have obviously read his underlying books, although not Maps for Meaning. I only made it about 30% of the way through the book. I really need to give it another crack. Need to read it again. It's a very deep book, but very interesting. And I listened to, I think, basically every podcast that he was on for quite a long time and trying to listen to his materials. He is a very interesting character, and I thought I'd talk a little bit about why I like him and what I gain from it. Now, Jordan B. Peterson, for those of you who may not be familiar and apparently are allergic to Google or something, Jordan B. Peterson is a psychologist from Canada. He taught at Harvard and McGill, and he got famous in response to a proposal from Canada, which was known as Bill C-60. 16? 60. 16. Bill C-16, in which he felt that the law as proposed would require people to use pronouns of transgendered people. So they would be required to use the pronouns that those people preferred. He opposed it on free speech grounds. This did not necessarily prevent anyone from calling him transphobic or saying that he was, a hateful person. But his philosophy, if you go listen to what he said, and I suppose you can think that his real motivations were otherwise, but if you just go based on what he said and his many podcasts on the subject, he always said that his philosophy or his objection was because of the compelled speech. And he differentiated between speech, which prevents people from saying certain things, which is not an unknown concept in Anglo-American law or Canadian law, and requires people to say certain things, which is a bit of an unknown. So he says, well, there might be restrictions on what we can say. No defamation, no slander, no libel, no fighting words. These might be the kinds of restrictions that prevent people from saying certain things. But to require individuals to say certain things is something that has been rejected. And he's right. This has been rejected by the U.S. Supreme Court and is kind of unknown in Anglo-American law. And he felt, at least, that Bill C-16, the way it was being interpreted, and perhaps not based on its literal text, but perhaps based more on the guidelines or the regulations that were being promoted by the associated agencies that would enforce it, were a problem. So this would be the rough equivalent, and I don't want to unduly mischaracterize it, but this is how I understand it. This would be the rough equivalent to not necessarily opposing the bill that Congress passes, but opposing it because the agency that will enforce it is promulgating regulations or guidelines or whatever that say how they're going to enforce it in such a way that is going to be a violation of this basic principle of liberty, of requiring you to say something. So it's not necessarily that the Canadian legislature's bill by its own terms required it, but it would be that the agency that was enforcing it, the Human Rights Tribunal or the Human Rights Commission, in sort of their guidelines and their teachings and their sort of doctrine and their regulations, would require people to use particular pronouns. And he said that that was wrong for the compelled speech reasons, which is a perfectly reasonable basis to oppose something. He wasn't saying that trans people deserve to be, treated poorly or should be, harassed or anything. he was simply saying that he didn't feel like he should be compelled to say something that he didn't necessarily believe was true, which is very interesting because it was the nature of truth, or the importance of truth, was a huge theme of his talk last night. And I'll get a little bit more into that, but let's talk a little bit more about his background. So that's sort of where he got his claim to fame, was in dealing with this issue. And since then, he's been on, I don't even know how many podcasts. He has his own channel. He was on Joe Rogan recently, like 2 days ago, and he was on Joe Rogan 5 other times, I believe, including once with Brett Weinstein, which was very interesting. He was on, perhaps maybe most infamously to those of us who follow him, on an interview with Kathy Newman from UK Channel 4. So what you're saying is, no, Kathy, I wasn't saying those things. Just over and over and over. So what you're saying is, it's a beautiful day, Kathy. So you're saying other days aren't beautiful? You look lovely today. So you don't think I look, so you don't think every woman looks lovely all the time? So what you're saying is most women are ugly? No, Kathy, I wasn't saying these. These particular examples are a bit hyperbolic, but get the point across, right? You were looking lovely today, Kathy. So you're saying most women look ugly? I really wasn't saying that, Kathy. Just over and over and over again, and it was kind of hilarious. Also, perhaps somewhat notably, he had been on H3H3 with Ethan Klein. Ethan Klein recently deleted those episodes because he's trying to cancel Jordan Peterson, which is a bit hilarious. But, and Ethan Klein's trying to claim he didn't know that much about him, which if you go listen to his podcast that he did, if you can find them, I suppose, Ethan Klein said, well, I read the book and seemed to be fairly familiar with the guy, and so forth and so on, right? So yeah, Jordan Peterson is sometimes called a gateway to the alt-right. I don't know what that means. He denounces the alt-right, and the alt-right denounces him. But he is a guy I find to be very interesting and intellectually inspiring. He's clearly smarter than me. On levels, he's smarter than me. I've listened to his stuff for, the better part of a couple years. I don't necessarily agree with literally everything he says. So I don't, I don't worship at the man's feet. I don't think he's, someone who is some sort of, I don't know, like cult leader, like I would rise or fall with him. But I find the vast, vast majority of what he says to be very persuasive and interesting. And so I find what little parts I do disagree with to be by no means deal breakers. Show me a person I will agree with 100% of the time, including, incidentally, myself. Do you think I agree with myself 100% of the time? I do not. But Jordan B. Peterson is someone that I agree with a large percentage of the time, large enough that I consider him to be someone worthy of paying attention to. Jordan Peterson is an interesting guy when you listen to him because he thinks in he thinks in abstractions. And this is very, very clear from his book, Maps Meaning, which was his first book, and by every possible dimension, his most complex. It's the deepest book. It basically, trying to sum it up, but it basically says how various tropes of media are maps in sort of the literal sense, I suppose, pointing us to various principles that are at the core sense of what meaning might be. So to take an example, if you have the sort of classic, knight in shining armor and some of the virtues that are associated with that, then those aspects of those stories are pointing to things that are one would desire to emulate, or things, or emulatable, or speaking to deep parts of our psyche. There's a reason in other words, that we find that kind of character or those kinds of tropes desirable. And those tropes or those characters can be seen not only in the knight in shining armor, but basically the knight in shining armor is perhaps a unique combination of these tropes. But each individual trope, or each individual thing, can be found in other characters. But it is so you can see the same thing from a bunch of different angles if you're paying attention. And the reason that people resonate the way they do with great works of fiction, superheroes, or Shakespeare's works, or poetry, or movies, the reason that people resonate with it is because when those characters or when those tropes are written particularly well, they are speaking to something that is, on some sense, fundamentally, capital T, true. There is something in there that is reaching for something that is, for lack of a better word, divine or fundamental, that these representations are discussing. And it's interesting because Jordan Peterson speaks a lot in these abstractions. He speaks a lot in metaphor, which is perhaps not a surprise because, as I mentioned, like his first book, which is the deepest, which he spent forever and a day writing. It took forever, and he said how he wrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it so many times. It represents the way that he thinks. He thinks in sort of he thinks not maybe not as much in words. He thinks maybe more in imagery, or he thinks more in metaphor. He thinks more in representation, and he thinks more in an abstraction. So it can be a little bit sometimes to work out what he's saying, because he doesn't say things in a distilled way. He says things in more of a representative way. So rather than speaking at the level of the representation, or rather than speaking at the level of the sort of the final resolution, like a character on a page, rather than speaking that way, he tends to speak like a level up or a level above that. So he doesn't speak about the knight in the shining armor. He speaks more about the tropes, or he speaks more about the abstraction, and it can be a little bit getting used to. And it is, you have to sort of really pay attention to what he's saying, because you have to unpack what he's saying and what is being said behind it. There's more subtext, I suppose. Maybe that's the way to think about it. There's more subtext with Peterson than there might be with your average person. So you have to work a little bit harder at it than you would for an normal person. And that kind of, at least to my mind, shows how much smarter that he is, because he is trying to reach for a complexity that is not a normal way of viewing things, and it is a more challenging to the listener perspective. And if you go watch that Kathy Newman interview on Channel 4, you kind of can see, well, how his words can be misunderstood if you're not paying attention. So I think it requires paying more attention to what he's saying than your average speaker, because so much more is behind what he's saying than for a normal person, because he's worked so much harder at a background. So maybe another metaphor, if you like, is that For most people, their ideas are maybe ships floating on the water. And for him, he's more of like an iceberg. So it might look one way on the surface, but there's so much more depth beneath it that it takes a lot more work to reach for him. And I find it fascinating. And I like Peterson in particular because I always feel like I have to notch my intellect up. I feel it is apparent to me that he is smarter than me. And I cannot generate what he has generated. Now, that might be partially because I'm not in his field of endeavor. But on some levels, I feel like even if I was in his field of endeavor, I wouldn't be able to generate what he's generating. So I can't create it. But so I find the fact that he can create it admirable, and I find that I have to notch my intelligence up to try to reach for what he's speaking to. And some of what he's saying in his books is not new in a lot of ways. He's been described as a self-help guru, which I feel is both accurate and demeaning. I find his work to have a lot more layers of depth to it compared to other self-help books. So you can find, in a lot of respects, a lot of things he's talked about in other people's works. It's just that there's a lot more behind it. Other people talk about, it's a little bit like reading the cliff notes about Nietzsche or Kant or something like that versus trying to actually read the person. There's levels of depth. You can try to simplify it in a lot of ways. And you get the sort of the end message. And in some senses, the end messages to a lot of what Peterson says are not particularly novel. You can find a lot of what he says in other people's works, which he wouldn't necessarily disagree with, because he would himself talk about, how these representations can come from a lot of different angles. What makes Peterson's work interesting, or what makes his work particularly enjoyable to me, is not end conclusions like tell the truth or treat yourself like someone you're responsible for helping, or even stand up straight with your shoulders back. These advice nuggets are not particularly unique, but what makes Peterson's work, to my mind, much more interesting than pretty much anyone else I've read is that there's layers of depth behind it that are much more interesting. So in a lot of other people's work, I find what they're saying to be superficial. I find what they're saying to be almost cliche. But Peterson's work, I don't find to be superficial or cliche. On one level, it might sound very similar, and I suppose on one level it is very similar. But there's a layer of depth to the man, and there's layers of depth to his work that make him really fascinating if you really, really dig for it. And this isn't necessarily to say that other people don't have those layers of depth, or other self-help layers don't have those layers of depth, but they're not communicated in their books. So at least in my mind, and perhaps you find other people maybe you find other authors deeper than I do, but at least in my mind, you could take another self-help book off the shelf and there's nothing there. And sometimes it feels fake. it feels like an illusion. There's plenty of self-help gurus who say things that I suppose in some sense are true, or they wouldn't be respected, but there's nothing behind them. And when they speak, you find them vapid, you find them thin. And if you're not, at least in my mind, paying enough attention, Peterson can come off that way too. Because he speaks in these abstractions, he speaks in these layers that make you work for them. So on a very, very superficial read of Peterson, you might find him to be vapid, or you might find him to be like an illusion, like nothing's there. But at least for my money, I don't think that's true. I think Peterson has layers of depth to it. And if you go read his book, Map of Meaning, which I think is his deepest work, then I think this rapidly becomes apparent that he has looked at this issue in layers of depth that are there if you're willing to scratch the surface. And I think that Peterson, somewhat to his own detriment, can be misunderstood if you're not willing to work for it because of the level he's communicating. And to some degree, I suppose that's his fault, because he has to communicate, but he's trying to communicate something much, much deeper. And so I'm not 100% sure it's possible to do it any better without losing the depth that he's trying to communicate at. So there's something really there. And I saw someone in chat mention Alan Watts. I think Alan Watts is also worthy of kind of mentioning in the same breath. Alan Watts is someone I need to get more into, to be honest. But I think has some of that depth there as well. So yeah, I don't think Jordan Peterson is like the only person who does this. I don't think he's necessarily even the only person alive who is doing this, but I think he is rare for the complexity of what is behind what he's saying. And I it's something you have to work for. I do think there is. Yeah, it could be Peterson speaks my language. That could be well true. Alley Cattles. It could well be that Peterson just speaks my language, and therefore I find that he resonates with me. That's well possible. So I'm not trying to suggest that there aren't other authors who might resonate more with someone else, and whose work may not have the depth, but I haven't personally found it, and I found it in Peterson. And this again isn't to say that I think that he is, a guru or that he's incapable of being wrong, or he's someone who should be followed blindly. But it is to say that I think, at least for myself, he's someone worthy of trying to understand and really gnaw deep to get the marrow out of the bones of what he's talking about. And I think when at least when I do, I find it to be well worth the effort in having done so. And he is, I think he is a valuable contributor. I continue to think that the people who criticize him don't get him and don't understand him, which again, I to some degree is understandable, because he speaks in a way that, if you like, for example, with Rogan, he was saying how there's no really such thing as climate. There's no, because they were talking about climate change, and he was saying, well, there's no such thing as climate. There's no such thing as environment. And then you have to actually go to listen to what he was actually saying. And he was saying, it's interesting, because he's pointing out that other people don't speak clearly, and he speaks in metaphor, which can be misunderstood. So maybe he's not speaking clearly sometimes, but he's speaking on a different level. So it's he sometimes invites criticism. But what he was saying was, or at least what I got out of it, what he was saying was that many people, when they talk about climate or they talk about environment, they're not clear about what they mean. And they start saying, well, climate is or environment is everything. We got to talk about, we got to talk about, weather. We got to talk about human populations. We got to talk about food and food distribution. We got to talk about, political borders. We got to talk about, a whole range of things. And he's like, sometimes some of these people, the way they talk about climate and environment, it's like they're talking about everything. And to talk about everything is to talk about nothing, because you need something more direct. And then, of course, when people talk about everything, but their models are only trying to address part of the problem, but they're talking about everything. It's a little bit, you've reduced a problem which by your own admission is very, very complex into a simplistic representation with ways that aren't necessarily clear. So I think he was trying to chastise people for not being clear. And then, of course, what people see is sort of the painted on veneer is that Peterson says, well, there's no such thing as climate, which I'm like, that's not what he meant. But it takes work, so there's some stuff there. All right, so let me talk to you a little bit about what he talked about last night. So he talked a lot about truth, which is a huge thing about him. He thinks that truth is important. This is not a particularly, well, I'd say not a controversial proposition, but I think it is, unfortunately. And he suggests last night, and this is not the only time he's ever said anything like this, that hell in kind of every possible manifestation of it is built on lies. And so he tried to come at this from a couple different viewpoints last night. So one viewpoint he comes at it with is by talking about Auschwitz, which, good way to get everyone's attention in a hurry, right? Let's talk about Auschwitz, right? So he says Auschwitz is evil. He says Auschwitz is bad. This is a conclusion the world sort of reached in Nuremberg, the Nuremberg conclusion. And people, the Nazis and the SS and Germans and other people who were engaged in Auschwitz, one of their defenses at the time, well, there were a couple defenses at the time, when they were being tried for war crimes. And some of these defenses included such things as, I was only following orders. This was my culture. This was my, this is my, just sort of my belief system or whatever, right? And so, he says, like, the moral relativists have a point. Things can be a little bit morally relative. But to suggest that they have a point doesn't suggest the end, doesn't suggest their ultimate conclusion of there is no morality is correct. To suggest morality is sometimes relative doesn't necessarily suggest it's always relative. And he says he said that the judgment of Nuremberg with respect to Auschwitz is that whatever moral relativism, whatever value it might have, does not allow you to defend what happened at Auschwitz. The judgment of Nuremberg is that moral relativism can't get you to a place where what occurred there was acceptable, let alone good. And he says, well, you can reject, I suppose, the judgment of Nuremberg, but when you do that, you wind up with things like Auschwitz in the first place. You can sort of reject the idea that Nuremberg was correct in its conclusions, but if you do that and you just go to a true absolute moral relativism, then you have no position from which to condemn any sort of good or to condemn any evil, and try to play that out in the world and see how it works out. And we did, and it wasn't really good. So we can sort of agree on a baseline principle that if anything is evil, if anything is bad, what the judgment of Nuremberg concludes is that Auschwitz is evil, Auschwitz is bad, and no amount of moral relativism can get you past that. And if you try to get past that, you just wind up in, endless misery, endless privation, endless death, endless maltreatment. You wind up, if you try to reject the premise that Auschwitz is bad, what you wind up with is Auschwitz. Right? So at some level, it's like, yeah, and if anything can be said to be bad or evil, that's bad. All right. And then he says, okay, well, if we agree that that's bad, can we necessarily agree what's good? It's like, well, maybe that's a little bit more tenuous in some ways. Just because you can define evil and define bad doesn't necessarily mean you have defined its opposite. But we might be able to conclude that anything that leads us away from that is good. If Auschwitz is bad, if Auschwitz is evil, and what is Auschwitz? What is it? And what he says, for example, what Auschwitz is basically maximum. It's infliction of pain and sorrow and cruelty for its own sake. It's infliction of misery for the sake of misery. Like there's no real higher purpose that's being achieved, at least in his view. It's infliction of cruelty and pain and misery and despair, sort of for its own sake, is sort of what he says what Auschwitz represents. And it's like, well, maybe if we didn't do that, that would be good. And so whatever leads us away from that would, in some sense, have to be good. It's like, okay, I mean, this is tenable. This is reasonable. And so he says, well, what led to it? And he talks about Sholonisky, talks about the Gulag Archipelago. He talks about, what can we learn from that book and other sort of totalitarian situations. And he says that what leads to those kinds of situations is lies. A lot of people lying a lot. Society lying a lot. And you have to realize that you are likely to be one of the liars. You're not likely to be one of the good people. He points out that people like Oskar Schindler are far and few between, even when such people are relatively protected, even when such people could say things without necessarily harm to themselves. People won't rise up because it's a lot easier in many circumstances to just go along, even if going along means, endless pain and misery. So even where people are in protected positions, they won't stand up against concentrated evil, and it's easier to go along, and people just tell lies, and eventually those lies catch up and they accumulate, and they can ultimately manifest in something like an Auschwitz, which is perhaps an extreme example, or perhaps the extreme example. But every sort of the existence of the totalitarian absolutist state is created on lies, and what is important, therefore, is to tell the truth. All right. I mean, this makes sense to me. And so then he talks about how things can be deceptive. He talked about how when he was a student, when he was a graduate student, he went to a Canadian, I believe, Canadian maximum security prison, wearing a cape, and how the prisoners kind of wanted his cape, and one of the prisoners kind of tried to save him from the rest. There's a bunch of these sort of like kind of thuggish looking people who are like, give us your clothes, which isn't really an offer, right? And this really kind of short guy who didn't look like very much kind of saved him from the rest. And later learned this short guy who had saved him, who was sort of a nondescript figure, sort of humble looking compared to his maximum security counterparts, that he got two police officers to dig their own graves, and as they begged for their lives because they had families, shot them in the back of the head and then buried them. It's like, oh, okay. So evil comes in many different packages, some of which are not necessarily readily apparent. And how evil can manifest itself in unexpected ways or in unexpected forms. And he talked about how you see the ideas, and he talked about a client he had as a psychologist when he was when he had clients who he had clients who were deathly afraid of things, and he had clients who would with any money they had just blow it all in drugs and wind up in a ditch. And how there is a lot of problems in the world. And so he sort of makes the contention that, if you look at it from a religious angle, religions teach about evil and lies and sin, which, as he's fond of noting, the word sin is also an archery term that means to miss the mark. So what is sin? It's missing the mark of perfection. Okay. So you can find this you can find these ideas religiously. You can find these ideas in the 20th century human experience. You can find these ideas in psychology, in how it ruins people's personal lives. You can find it in sort of the lies that wind people up in maximum security prisons through self-deceit and through a pathway that paints them towards evil, and it's all largely rooted in lies. And the salvation is in the truth. In a religious sense, in a psychological sense, in a human history sense, that truth is an antidote to these evils. Like, okay. So there's a lot of value in that, in my opinion. There's a lot of value in tell the truth, or at least don't lie, which, as he points out, are two different propositions. Tell the truth is hard. Tell the truth might be impossibly hard. Because which of us knows capital T truth, right? So tell the truth might be impossibly hard. But at the very least, what we can do is not lie. We cannot actively, knowingly tell falsehoods. That much we can do. And that much would be a good thing for us to do. It's like, okay, I accept these premises. I accept these beliefs. And you don't necessarily have to believe it religiously. You can, if you're so inclined, believe that religions are not, in some sense, capital T true. You don't necessarily need to believe, for example, that there is a God. And you don't even necessarily need to know, you don't even necessarily need to even look at religion at all for conclusions like lies, knowing falsehoods, knowing deception, knowing cultural deceptions, knowingly allowing these things to exist has shown in the world in a sort of manifest objective sense. You don't even need to go to the supernatural at all. We can just stick with the natural and just look at, for example, the 20th century and sort of what happened in Maoist China or in Russia or in Nazi Germany or in, take your pick of South American countries and communist states, and maybe to some degree what's happening or what might be starting to happen in some parts of the world when it comes to some of the more totalitarian measures of even Western states. It's like it becomes incumbent to recognize these evils and recognize that lies and going to get along and not standing up and not speaking the truth and not bringing light into the darkness can be distilled from purely objective criteria. And if you don't like that, you can just show it for yourself. Telling lies to yourself doesn't allow you to be all that you can be. And it might be convenient in some sense and flattering in some sense to tell lies to yourself, but it ultimately does not wind you up in as well as you could be. And if you take it kind of down the darkest roads possible, you wind up in, some pretty ugly places that might have started somewhat innocently, and you wound up and you're like, where am I going and why am I in this handbasket? You don't necessarily need to believe in the supernatural. You don't need to believe in hell in some sort of supernatural sense. It's like we can just say Auschwitz existed and Auschwitz is hell, if there ever was one, and kind of call it a day. It's like, fair enough, man. Fair enough. It's there's something there that can be distilled. And one of the reasons that religions in some sense exist is also to try to distill these truths, because these truths are as deep in the human experience as you care to go. And religion exists, at least on some level, to try to explain these terrors and horrors of the world. And the religions that have existed for a long time, even if their more grandiose claims about the nature of the supernatural are not correct, there nevertheless are some capital T truths in them, if anything can be said to be capital T truths, because many different religion, and for that matter, non-religious aspects, are kind of all pointing to similar things. So again, the sort of more supernatural elements of, for example, of the Christian faith may or may not be true, but whether or not they are or not, a lot of what the Bible has to say is true, and you can kind of see that in also non-religious works. Great works of what we would all agree are fiction. Great works of drama, great characters, great movies, great books of all kinds are all trying to point to some things that are capital T true. And even in like the Marvel superhero movies, where none of us think it's literally true, are still pointing to things through the iconography or the imagery that are pointing at things that are true. And that's, again, his book's Maps to Meaning. That's what that's all about, right? How these are maps to meaning. So, there is something there that is valuable. He didn't really talk about this last night that much, but he would talk about in other contexts about how the Western world is built on Judeo-Christian values, and Ben Shapiro talks about this as well. The sort of Judean, Roman, Grecian sort of values that underpin Western society, and these values have been successful and raised people up. And so, if nothing more than in a sort of realpolitik way of let's look at the results, they are true. Is the Western conception true? Well, in the realpolitik sense of it has led to humanity's being able to be lifted up, then there's something that must be true about it, because it's gotten us closer to where we all collectively would want to be. So I find all this pretty interesting. I find all this very, very interesting. And there's levels to Peterson's ideas that I feel like I'm just poking at the surface levels of what he has to say. And there is a lot there that I find is worthy of consideration and value. And I feel like the man has done his homework on these things and is speaking out of a place of deeply considered reflection from a variety of angles. So it is it's he has something that's valuable and important to say, and I find that admirable. So that's a little bit about what he talked about last night. That's a little bit about some of his ideas that I'm sort of trying to desperately, faithfully represent. Which, how close I'm getting is questionable, but we do our best. So we do our best. Let me take a look at the super chats. Make sure to read those out. And I'll try to read some questions or talk about this a little bit more. Maybe we'll do a watch party together, because I've only made it about an hour into the interview with Peterson that was on Rogan recently. Not now, because it's a little late, but maybe we can do a watch party and we can watch Peterson Rogan's discussion together. That might be fun for a couple hours, maybe potentially with commentary and me trying to explain it to myself, which can always be, a fun thing to watch, maybe. £5 from Philip from London. Hello, just to say loved your channel, all the best. SDFU gave me $2 to say there are 4 lights. $5 from Zena B. No comment. Thank you for your contribution. Eric Allen gave me $20. I love this talk and understand what you're saying about him. I also see it in a slightly different light, but not completely disagreeing. Also, shout out to Thomas Merton Aquinas and Marcus Achilles as poet philosophers. Anti-Commie gave me $10. Peterson is okayish. So well is King, though. He's pretty awesome too. Yeah, Saul is awesome too. I don't blame you for enjoying his work. $2 from STFU FFS. Change is the only constant with the weather. $20 from Super Iron Bob. Jordan B. Peterson is debate with Harris on truth. Had an interesting definition of truth, which incorporated need for completeness of truth. Wherein incomplete truths that lean only to bad ends aren't true, if made only up of true things. Yeah, well, that debate on truth was a train wreck. As I'm sure anyone who tried to watch it will agree. But his 4-part series he did with Sam Harris, was very, very interesting. And we could play just sort of the part where they sort of sum up each other's philosophies, I think from night 2. I think we can play that on stream, and I think that would be interesting. $5 from Bear Business, just says hail. Hello. $2 from STFU FFS. You don't have to believe in God. He'll forgive you. $5 from Shut Up I Can Cook. Loving your content. Then Shut Up I Can Cook says, what is getting pegged if you know? I do know, and I believe that so do you. $4.99 from Johnny F. Face. Not a Pearson fan in any way, shape, or form, but I often learn from Uncivil Law. I'm going to go back and watch this from the beginning. Thank you. $5 from Peter. Peterson is a philosopher. Speaking of truth, self-help writers are applying this truth more concretely. And $27.99 Canadian dollars from Elaine Weldon saying you are the best. Well, that is very kind. Thank you, Elaine. I appreciate it as always. So I think it would be interesting. Let me pull up on stream this sort of discussion where Peterson and Sam Harris discuss each other's philosophies, because I think it is interesting and sort of summing up their philosophies. So let me find this. All right, so let me pull this up on stream real fast. All right, so this is Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson in Vancouver, part 2. And obviously Weinstein is moderating. And I'll just play out a little bit of this that we can listen to.
Attempt to keep that momentum going, what we are going to do is we are going to have Sam and Jordan steelman each other's points from last night so that you can hear what that sounds like. Now, for those of you who have ever tried steelmanning somebody's point with whom you have a severe disagreement, you know just how hard this is. So let's give them some leeway. Sam, would you be willing to start?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Well, first, let me just make the obvious point that probably isn't so obvious unless you take the time to put yourself in our shoes. But just imagine how surreal it is for us to be who we are, simply having a conversation about ideas, and to be able to put a date on the calendar and have all of you show up for this. I mean, it's just an amazing privilege. Thank you for coming out. So here is what I think Jordan thinks I'm getting wrong. I think that was grammatically correct. Maybe there's another note in there, but Clearly, I don't understand how valuable stories are, how deep they go, the degree to which stories encode not only the wisdom of our ancestors, but quite possibly the wisdom born of the hard knocks of evolution of the species, right? So there's no telling how deep the significance of the information encoded in stories goes. And there's a class of stories that are religious stories, and they're religious for a reason, because they're dealing with the deepest questions in human life. They're questions about what constitutes a good life, what's worth living for, what's worth dying for. These are things that if each individual just thrust onto the stage of his own life, not knowing where he is and tasked with figuring out how to live all on his own, or even in a collection of others who are similarly unguided by ancient wisdom, this is not knowledge we can recapitulate for ourselves easily. And so we edit or ignore these ancient stories at our peril, at minimum at some considerable risk, because we don't know how much, we don't really know what baby is in the bathwater. And so we should have immense respect for these traditions. And this is yet to be discovered tonight. I'm still not quite clear about how this links up with more metaphysical propositions about the origins of certain of these stories. But at minimum, my criticism of religion, because it tends to focus on the most obvious case of a zero-sum contest between religious dogmatism and scientific open-ended discussion, doesn't address this core issue of the significance of religious thinking and religious narrative, because I am, for the most part, just shooting fish in a barrel, criticizing fundamentalists, and the kind of God that the fundamentalists believe in, the God who's an invisible person who hates homosexuals, obviously that's not the deepest version of these religious, this essentially what is a narrative technology for orienting human life in the cosmos. So maybe I'll leave it there, but that's, I think, what Jordan thinks.
All right, Jordan, before you steelman Sam's point, how did you feel about his encapsulation of yours?
Well, I'm convinced, man. No, look, I mean, well, I got a couple of things to say about it. It's like, first of all, I think it was accurate, concise, fair. I also think that this is a more technical note in some sense, is that if you ever want to think about something, that's exactly what you have to do, right? You want to take arguments that are against your perspective and you want to make them as strong as you possibly can so that you can fortify your arguments against them. You don't want to make them weak, because that just makes you weak. And so, Sam and I are both scientists, and it really is the case that what scientists are trying to do, and I think what we're actually trying to do in this conversation genuinely, is to try to find out if there's something that we're thinking that's stupid. Because when I'm laying out the arguments that Sam just summarized so well, I've tried to generate a bunch of opposition to them in my own imagination. And the arguments I put forward are ones I can't undermine. But that doesn't mean they're right. It doesn't mean that at all. And so if someone comes along and this is certainly the case if you're a scientist who's worth his or her salt, if someone comes along and says, hey, look, you made a mistake in this fundamental proposition, it's like, yes, great. That means I can make progress towards a more solid theory of being. And that's what we're trying to do. And I do think it's working. And so I thought that was just fine, exactly dead on. And I hope I can do justice to your position as well. So I'm going to summarize Sam's argument briefly. And then I'm going to tell him, let you guys know why he thinks what things I'm not taking into account. So Sam believes that there are two fundamental dangers to psychological and social stability. Religious fundamentalism, essentially on the right, and moral relativism and nihilism on the left. And so the danger of the right-wing position is that it enables people to arbitrarily establish certain revealed axioms as indisputable truth, and then to tyrannize themselves and other people with the claims that those are divine revelations. And he sees that as part of the danger of religious fundamentalism, and maybe religious thinking in general, but also as something that characterizes secular totalitarian states that also has a religious aspect. So that's on the right. And then on the left, well, the problem with the moral relativism nihilism position is that it leaves us with no orientation, and it also flies in the face of common sense observations that there are ways to live that are bad and that there are ways to live that are good that people can generally agree on, and that statements about those general agreements about how to live can be considered factual. Now, and then the next part of Sam's argument is that we require a value system that allows us to escape these twin dangers. One stultifies us and the other leaves us hopeless, let's say. And that value system has to be grounded in something real. And the only thing that he can see that actually constitutes real in any provable sense, and there's a certain amount of historical and conceptual weight behind this claim, is the domain of empirical facts as they've been manifested in the sciences and technologies that have made us incredibly powerful and increasingly able to flourish in the world. And so we need to ground our value propositions in something that we've been able to determine has genuine solidity so that we can orient ourselves properly, so that we can make moral claims and that we can avoid these twin dangers. We can begin with some basic facts that we can identify, as I mentioned briefly, what constitutes a bad life: endless pain, suffering, anxiety, tremendous amount of negative emotion, short-term lifespan, all the things that no one would choose voluntarily for themselves if we would all agree that they were thinking in a healthy manner. And we can contrast that sort of domain of horror with the good life, which might involve, well, certainly freedom from privation and want and undue threat and anxiety and hope for the future and all of that, and that we can agree that those are poles, good, bad, and good, and that that's a factual claim. So Sam also claims that we can define the good life, this is an extension of it, with reference to flourishing and well-being, and that can actually be measured, and that we should and can inform the idea of flourishing and well-being with empirical data. Having said all that, he also leaves a domain of inquiry open that would be centered on the possibility that some of the ideas that have been encapsulated in religious phenomenology, if not in religious dogma, might be worth pursuing as well, that there might be wisdom that could practically be applied in terms of perception to spiritual practices, although those become increasingly dangerous as they become ensconced in dogma. And so that's Sam's position. And then his criticism of my ideas, he would say that it's facts, not stories, that constitute the ground for the proper science of well-being, and that we don't need to be connected to stories, ancient stories in particular, to thrive. And the reason for that are that these ancient stories are pathological in certain details, especially in the specific claims they make, which look outrageous in some sense from a modern moral perspective. And he believes that it's hand-waving to ignore those specific topics with a what would you call it, an optimistic overview of the entire context, that they're dangerously outdated now, if they ever were useful, that they're subject to too many potential interpretations for any modern usage to be reliably derived. And so he believes that attempts to interpret these stories, let's say, are rife with so many potential errors of bias and interpretation and subjectivity that all the interpretations in some sense are unreliable, and perhaps equally unreliable. That worse than that, not only are they unreliable, but they're dangerous insofar as the claims they lay out pose a threat to scientific and Enlightenment values, which are the true saviors of humanity, as evidenced by our progress, let's say, over the last 200 or 300 years, and that they're also susceptible to the totalitarian interpretation, which I described earlier, which confer upon the interpreter a sense of and then a claim to revealed truth. And so I would say that's Sam's argument and his criticisms of my position. So,
okay, so you write my next book. I'll write yours. Yeah.
So I thought that was really, really interesting. And as people in the chat were saying that Sam Harris might have gone off the deep end in the last 2 years. I couldn't really speak intelligently to that, to be honest. Not close follower of Sam Harris's, so I don't know to which propositions, but that's really great stuff because they're basically trying to show each other, some weaknesses in argument. And I love that kind of shit because you're really trying to think at the highest levels of thinking. This 4-part discussion was a good discussion. The one where they got lost on truth is interesting. One of Harris's criticisms of Peterson is that Peterson is not particularly clear about his belief in supernatural, which I think is correct and continues to be correct to my perception. Peterson is frustratingly vague about his own belief in supernatural. He has this line now where he says if you ask him if he believes in God, he says, well, he acts like God exists, which doesn't really tell you anything in some ways, because again, it's kind of Peterson himself has been saying, and I think he's correct in a lot of ways, that some of the capital T truths, to the extent they exist in religion, are not unique and can be derived from other non-religious aspects. You can see it from psychology. You can see it from, the experiences of the 20th century. You can find these truths in other domains, which kind of makes sense, right? Because if there are truly capital T truths, then it isn't necessarily surprising that you might be able to get to them through multiple independent means. So there might be completely non-religious ways to derive some of these capital T truths. And so the religious literature, even if it is incorrect about its more supernatural claims, nonetheless might have some of these capital T truths. And that is part of the reason that they are so attractive in the first place, is because they have they were the first, and they're the longest lasting distillations or representations of these truths. So you could, at least in principle, perhaps reject the supernatural elements and reject the divine elements and still say that things are true. So one thing that Harris is cracked about is that Peterson is frustratingly vague about whether or not he believes in any of these supernatural elements. And that is a bit of a problem. So, yeah. So he, for example, will not answer questions like, if he believes Jesus truly, if like the story of Jesus dying and physically resurrecting and physically ascending are true. He won't answer questions like, is there like these things have, at least in a way that's clear. And I think he's evasive on that aspect for whatever reason that he's evasive, but yeah. So it is a little bit annoying, although there is sort of one moment where I think he kind of reveals it. And let me see if I can find this. I believe there was a moment in the discussion with Matt Delahunty where there was a question from the audience. I'm looking for this. Give me a second. Well, I'm not going to find it right now, but there was a line in the Matalhane debate where someone in the audience asked something like, if every human disappeared, would God continue to exist? And let me see if I can, I want to find this line. I can't find it. I don't want you guys having to watch me flail around trying to find something. I'm not quite sure where it is. But yeah, this is some really good stuff. So yeah, I think yeah. And Captain Wetbeard says, no, I think God's existence requires faith to sustain, which, from a classically Christian perspective, right? The answer is that God perceives man, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So, like, God exists independently of beings from the Christian perspective. So, if he's a Christian, the answer is yes. If every human disappears, God continues to exist. That would be the Christian answer from a classically Christian perspective. God spoke the world into existence. God preceded man and the world. So, if you ask a Christian, if every human being disappears, does God continue to exist? The answer would be yes. God precedes man and God is eternal. So the fact that he wasn't able to answer it maybe suggests that he is not a Christian in a more conventional sense. So there is that. But yeah, I can't quite find. I can't quite find the moment I was looking for. I'm pretty sure it's in this debate between Jordan and Matt Delahunty, but I can't quite find the moment in the debate where they answer that question. So yeah, so that's. Well, I think that was the closest where he ever got. Yeah, search for the transcript. Let's see if I can find the transcript. Find what I'm looking for in this transcript. I have to find the exact words, of course, that I'm looking for. Let's see if I can find this moment in English. No. For some reason, I can't do that right now. I don't know why. Oh, well. It'll have to wait. I think Peterson is evasive on the God question because he doesn't know. That might very well be true. That he doesn't know the answer. Yeah, that might very well be true because he doesn't know the answer. That might well be right. Let me just see if there's any new super chats that came in, and I'll wrap this thing up. $20 from Steve C. Thank you for the Peterson review. Enjoying your content. You're welcome. $2 from STFU FFS. Rogan Peterson was great. It has been every single time. I just haven't watched the last one in full. Weinstein Peterson was also great. There was hour number 2 of that discussion. I had to watch a couple times to keep up with what was saying. Anthony L gave me $5. Thank you, Kurt, for highlighting an overall unbiased analysis of Peterson's way of thinking. I appreciate him. His maps and meaning stuff is very good. So SDFU gives me $2. Say hail lobster. Well, hail lobster to you as well. Rag Jules says Canadian dollars for $13.99. Thanks for tonight. I learned of you from Nick Rackett's channel, aka Rakita. You're great. $49.99 from Darcy Dornsfife. Thank you very much, Darcy, for the $49.99. No comment, but your super chat is extremely appreciated. $5 from Shut Up I Can Cook. Love it. Peterson is a brain. What do you think about Dr. Joe Dispenza, if anything? I'm not familiar with that, I don't think. $2 from SDFU FFS. Look busy. Jesus may be watching. Peterson's ethos kind of $5 from Super Iron Bob. Hamlet Mill is an interesting discussion of ancient religions with the development of knowledge that may shed light on Peterson's views. And $2 says, $2 from SDFU. God doesn't need man, man needs God. I mean, that would be the more conventional view, SDFU, but I think Peterson's answer was the opposite, if memory serves correctly, in that debate. $9.99 from Johnny F. Face. In the past couple of years, Sam has reconsidered the ethics of providing a platform for those messages he finds particularly dangerous or those who refuse to agree at a minimum with what words mean. You know, I mean, maybe there might be something there. I haven't been following Sam Harris's particularly closely. I was never a huge fan of Harris. Not that I disliked him either, but you know, I liked him, but I was never like the hugest fan of him. Not to say anything mean about the guy. So I don't know where his views have shifted in the last couple of years. I won't comment too deeply about that. I'm going to sign off for now. I hope you enjoyed this stream. Check out Peterson's work. Check out some of his podcasts he's done with. If you want to get started, check out some of the stuff he's done with Joe Rogan. He's done 5 or 6 podcasts with him. It's a great way to get started listening to him. There's many great discussions with Peterson. You can find his book. Read it. It's interesting. You might find it interesting too. So I'm going to sign off for now. If you have enjoyed this stream, please remember to give it a like. If you're not subscribed already, please subscribe. If you're a fan of the lobster, be a lobster. A real lobster would hit the like button and hit subscribe. So remember to do all those things. I've been Uncivil Law. Until later, my friends, I hope all is well. Cheers and good night.